The unexpected door, the morning sun streamed through the towering glass windows of Blackwood International, painting the lobby in golden light that shimmered across polished marble floors. The building itself was a monument to ambition, rising into the skyline like a sharp declaration of dominance. People in sharp suits and precise shoes hurried in and out, their movements reflecting the rhythm of a company that pulsed with the power of global finance. For Olivia Hart, this world was both terrifying and thrilling. She had dreamed of working here since her college years, long nights spent poring over translation manuals and practicing obscure dialects until her voice cracked from fatigue. And now, here she was, her first day as the company's lead communications secretary, responsible for helping bridge Blackwood International's business empire across continents and cultures. It was an opportunity that could reshape her life forever, but only if she managed to keep her nerves under control. Olivia's heels clicked against the polished floor as she rushed through the corridors, clutching her tablet against her chest. Her throat was dry, her pulse racing faster than her footsteps. She had woken up at 5 in the morning to make sure she was ready, had ironed her modest navy dress twice, and checked her badge more times than she could count. Yet fate had a cruel way of mocking preparation. A traffic jam on her commute had stolen 15 minutes. The elevator had paused between floors for what felt like hours. And now her bladder was betraying her at the worst possible time. She scanned the hallway for signs of a restroom, panic creeping in as each door bore plaques filled with titles and numbers she didn't recognize. Finally, she spotted a discreet silver sign etched with a symbol that, in her hurried state, looked like the universal figure for a restroom. Without thinking, she pushed through the heavy door and stepped inside. At once, she knew something was wrong. This was no corporate bathroom. The air carried the soft, calming scent of eucalyptus and lavender, mixed with the faint hum of classical music from hidden speakers. The lighting was gentle and warm, casting a soft glow over walls of stone and wood polished to perfection. At the far end, water trickled into a small pool, steam rising in thin curls into the air. Her stomach sank. She had wandered into someplace private. Her instinct screamed at her to turn around, to retreat before anyone noticed. But before she could move, the sound of running water ceased. Silence fell, broken only by her shallow breathing. Then, footsteps. From around the corner of the spa-like chamber, a tall figure emerged, his presence commanding even before her brain processed who he was. He wore nothing but a towel secured loosely at his waist, droplets of water still clinging to his shoulders and chest. His hair was damp, pushed back in careless waves. It was James Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood International, the man whose name alone carried weight in global markets. For Olivia, time froze. Her mind, usually so sharp and articulate, dissolved into a haze of disbelief. She had seen his portrait in company newsletters, on magazine covers, even in business school case studies. Yet none of those images had prepared her for the reality of standing face-to-face with him. He radiated authority, his eyes sharp yet unreadable, his very presence enough to command silence. "This is a private executive spa," he said, his voice cool and measured, as though every word were weighed before being released. "Care to explain why you're here?" Olivia's mouth went dry. Her mind scrambled for an answer that didn't sound foolish. I'm sorry," she stammered, heat flooding her cheeks. "I was looking for the restroom. I must have gotten lost. It's my first day." His eyes narrowed slightly, studying her not with anger, but with the practiced scrutiny of someone who built empires on observation. "The employee restrooms are 2 floors down," he said at last, his voice steady. Not raised, but carrying the weight of authority. "This floor is restricted access." "I understand," Olivia said quickly, clutching her tablet like a lifeline. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'm Olivia Hart, the new secretary assigned to the communications division." Her words spilled. Out too fast, betraying her nerves. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Hart," he repeated slowly. "You're the one with the multilingual portfolio, the graduate from Geneva." "Yes," she whispered, then added in a self-deprecating tone, though right now I feel less like a professional and more like a lost intern. For the briefest moment, his lips curved, not quite a smile, but close enough to unsettle her. He straightened, his posture as precise as the steel beams that held up the building. The morning briefing starts in 5 minutes. I suggest you find your way to the correct floor. Relief rushed through her, and she nodded quickly, ready to flee. But fate seemed determined to humiliate her further. As she turned, her heel snagged on the plush carpet, sending her stumbling forward. Instinctively, she reached out to steady herself, and her hand landed squarely against his chest. The contact was electric, the warmth of his skin radiating beneath. Her palm, for a suspended heartbeat, neither of them moved. His hand had risen as well, catching her elbow with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his usual reputation for cold efficiency. "I'm sorry," she whispered, snatching her hand back as though burned. "This is not how I planned to make a first impression." Something unreadable flickered in his eyes, something softer than the steel exterior he was known for. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it wasn't." He released her arm, his voice returning to its usual clipped tone. "We'll discuss your navigation skills later. For now, you'd better not miss your meeting." Olivia nodded, cheeks burning, and practically fled from the room. Her steps echoed through the hallways as she finally found the correct floor, lungs straining as though she had run a marathon. She slipped into the meeting room with seconds to spare, earning curious glances from colleagues but no direct questions. She sat, her heart still racing, her mind replaying the moment again and again. The way his hand had steadied her, the look in his eyes. Had it been curiosity? Amusement? Or was she imagining it entirely? What Olivia didn't see, as she hurried away, was James Blackwood watching her leave, his expression thoughtful. For years, his life had been a fortress of control. Each day measured in numbers and negotiations, emotions buried beneath layers of discipline. Yet in a single unplanned moment, something had cracked through his carefully constructed facade, and for reasons he couldn't yet name, he found himself unwilling to let it go. The weight of expectations. Olivia's first week at Blackwood International had been anything but ordinary. The awkward incident in the executive spa lingered in her mind like a ghost that refused to fade. She replayed every detail at night when she was supposed to be resting, wondering if her clumsy mistake would be remembered forever as a black mark against her name. Yet to her surprise, James Blackwood hadn't mentioned it again. He hadn't mocked her, hadn't dismissed her for unprofessional behavior. Instead, he seemed to have chosen a more unsettling response. He tested her every morning after that encounter. Olivia arrived at her desk to find a stack of assignments that felt impossible to finish within the time given. Lengthy documents requiring translations to multiple languages were handed to her with curt notes in James's distinctive handwriting. No errors. Complete by noon. It wasn't just the words that weighed on her, it was the unspoken message that he expected perfection and nothing less. At first, panic clawed at her throat each time she saw his requests. But slowly, determination replaced fear. She hadn't fought her way through years of education and countless rejections, only to crumble. At the first real challenge, if James Blackwood wanted to test her limits, then she would show him she had no limits to break. On Monday morning, the pressure became almost unbearable. James sent her a series of contracts in German, Mandarin, and Arabic, all of them legally. Binding agreements tied to multi-million-dollar projects. Each required not only word-for-word translation, but also cultural adaptation to ensure that the agreements were acceptable to foreign partners. Olivia's fingers trembled as she read the cover page, but she forced herself to take a deep breath and dive in. She worked without pause, her focus narrowing to the rhythm of typing keys and the careful selection of words that carried weight in both language and culture. By 11:55 a.m., she walked into James's office with the completed translations. Neatly bound in her hands, he looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face, before his expression hardened back into its usual mask. "You're early," he remarked, his tone neutral. "I allowed time for review," Olivia said, keeping her voice steady. Though her heart pounded like a drum inside her chest, James flipped through the documents, scanning each page with the sharp eye of a man who missed nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as his gaze moved line after line. Finally, he set the papers down and looked directly at her. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw frustration flicker in his expression, not at her, but at his own failure to find an error. Your technical skills match your credentials, he admitted at last, his voice cool but not dismissive. But skill on paper isn't enough. Let's see how you handle pressure in real time. The very next day, she found herself thrust into a video conference with Japanese investors. There had been no preparation, no briefing, no chance to look up industry terms. James simply gestured toward her chair, his eyes challenging, as though daring her to falter. Olivia swallowed her fear and sat down, her palms slick with sweat. As the meeting began, James deliberately used obscure financial jargon. Watching her closely as she scrambled to interpret complex concepts in real time, her voice shook at first, but as the conversation deepened, she found her rhythm. By the end, her words flowed with steady confidence, each translation crisp and precise. For the rest of the week, the challenges only grew. James would summon her. 2 meetings at the last minute, expecting her to interpret hours of technical discussion without warning. He dropped urgent documents on her desk, just as she was preparing to leave for the day. Watching her with that same unreadable expression as she tackled the tasks without hesitation. And though exhaustion weighed on her, though her nerves frayed, under the relentless tests, Olivia never broke. She pushed herself harder, proving to herself as much as to him that she belonged in this company. Her resilience did not go unnoticed. Other executives began to whisper about the new secretary who handled impossible assignments with grace. Some admired her, some envied her, but all of them paid attention. Olivia was no longer invisible in the sprawling empire of Blackwood International. She was becoming someone to watch. Yet the most unsettling attention came from James himself. He rarely praised her, rarely revealed more than a cool nod of acknowledgement. But every so often, in those fleeting moments when their eyes met across a boardroom table, or as she handed him a finished report, she sensed something deeper, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even respect, hidden behind the steel of his gaze. And once, just once, when she stumbled over a phrase during a late-night assignment, he had corrected her gently, his voice softer than she had ever heard it before. The memory haunted her long after she had gone home, but Olivia also began to notice the weight that James carried. Beneath his unyielding exterior, there was a tension in his shoulders that never seemed to leave, a weariness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. He was a man who had built walls so high that even his closest advisors could not climb them. And yet somehow, she had stumbled through one of those walls by accident. Quite literally on her first day. What neither of them realized was that this unplanned, fragile thread between them would soon be tested by forces far beyond translation. Assignments and boardroom meetings. For Olivia, the real test was not whether she could keep up with James's impossible demands. It was whether she could withstand the collision of ambition, pride, and vulnerability that was destined to come. And for James, a man who believed emotions had no place in business, the challenge would be even greater. Because for the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of something he could not control, something that threatened to change the carefully constructed life he had built. Asterisk cracks in the armor, the second month at Blackwood International brought with it storms Olivia had never imagined. She had survived the first wave of impossible assignments, late-night translations, and tense boardroom confrontations, but her trials were far from over. The company was entering negotiations with a major European conglomerate and alliance that could shift markets and cement Blackwood International as a global titan for decades to come. It was the kind of deal whispered about in financial circles, the kind that made or broke reputations. For James Blackwood, failure was not an option. For Olivia Hart, the secretary who had stumbled into his world by accident, it was a chance. To prove herself in ways she had never dared to dream, the pressure began with silence. James offered no explanation when he placed her name on the team roster for the upcoming talks in Berlin. He simply delivered the news in his clipped tone, his eyes fixed on her as if daring her to object. Fear coiled in her stomach. Another force stirred within her, the determination not to let this opportunity pass. She had not come this far to be merely a background player. The flight to Berlin was a blur of nerves and preparation. Olivia sat across from James in the private jet, surrounded by executives who murmured over financial projections and legal frameworks. James was a wall of silence, his laptop open, his gaze unrelenting. Occasionally his eyes flicked toward her, as though measuring her presence against the weight of the task ahead. Olivia forced herself to study every document, every cultural nuance, every phrase that could tip the balance between success and disaster. The negotiations began in a grand hall, adorned with chandeliers that glittered like frozen constellations. The German executives arrived with precise smiles and sharp questions, their words carrying layers of meaning that could easily slip through careless translations. Olivia felt her pulse hammering as she took her seat at the side of the table. Tablet ready, hands steady, despite the storm inside. At first the talks flowed smoothly. Olivia translated with precision, her voice firm, her timing perfect. But midway through the second day, a storm brewed. One of the German delegates posed a question wrapped in metaphor, a phrase that, if mistranslated, could be taken as an insult. James leaned forward to respond, his voice low, his tone confident, but the phrase he chose in return carried a sharpness that risked escalating tension. Olivia's heart lurched. She could see the shift in the Germans' eyes, the stiffening of their posture. Without thinking, she interrupted softly, her tone respectful yet firm, offering an alternative phrasing that reframed James's response into a compliment rather than a challenge. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Where there had been rising tension, there was now cautious curiosity. The German delegate nodded, his suspicion replaced by interest. James's eyes flicked toward her, sharp as a blade, but not with anger. Something. Elle's surprise, perhaps even grudging admiration, continued the discussion, now more measured, his words subtly guided by her translations. By the end of the day, the atmosphere had transformed from brittle hostility to tentative cooperation. That night, as the executives dispersed, Olivia sat alone in the quiet of the hotel lobby, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. She had saved the meeting from disaster, but she knew it had not gone unnoticed. She felt his presence before she saw him. James approached, his steps silent but deliberate, his expression unreadable. He stopped in front of her, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed. "You corrected me today," he said at last, his voice low, even. Olivia's stomach clenched. "I only wanted to make sure the meaning was clear," she replied carefully. Sometimes direct translations can sound harsher than intended. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, to her astonishment, James nodded. "You were right," he admitted, his tone carrying no resentment. Yet I continued, "The deal might have collapsed." He studied her, his eyes narrowing as though seeing her for the first time. "You are more than what I expected." The words lingered in the air like something fragile, something precious. Olivia's breath caught, her heart racing. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, grateful that her instincts had not failed her. The following days tested them further. Each negotiation brought new challenges, each cultural nuance another trap, waiting to unravel months of preparation. Yet Olivia and James began to fall into an unspoken rhythm. Where he was sharp, she softened. Where he was cautious, she bridged with warmth. Together, they became a balance that neither of them had expected. And though James never openly praised her again, his eyes told another story each time she guided the talks toward calmer waters. On the final evening, after the last signatures were inked and the alliance secured, there was a celebration. Laughter filled the grand hall. Glasses clinked, and executives exchanged congratulations. Olivia stood at the edge of the room, her exhaustion hidden beneath a polite smile. She felt out of place among the glittering gowns and tailored suits. A secretary among giants. Yet before the night ended, James crossed the floor toward her, his presence cutting through the noise. "You carried more weight in this deal than some of the men at that table," he said quietly, so only she could hear. His words carried no warmth, but there was something in his tone that felt like respect. Olivia swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I was only doing my job," she whispered. His gaze lingered, and for a brief moment the mask slipped. Beneath The steel there was something else. Something human, something weary, something that longed for more than endless deals and polished numbers. Then it was gone, hidden once more behind the fortress he had built. That night, as Olivia returned to her room, she realized something had shifted. She had proven herself not just as an employee, but as someone capable of standing at the edge of the storm without breaking. And James Blackwood, the man who had once looked at her as little more than a lost intern, now looked at her as an equal in ways that unsettled them both. But the journey was far from over. For every crack in James's armor, there were layers still hidden. And Olivia knew, deep in her heart, that the story unfolding between them was no longer just about business. It was about something far more dangerous, far more powerful, the possibility of change. Asterisk. Shadows behind the glass, the weeks after the Berlin negotiations, moved with an almost dizzying speed. Blackwood International was no longer just a company making headlines. It was now the name whispered across continents, the benchmark others measured themselves against. The German deal had solidified James Blackwood's empire, and yet, beneath the triumphant reports and flashing stock tickers, Olivia sensed something that numbers could not reveal. James became more unpredictable. Some days he buried himself. In silence, his commands delivered with cold precision, his eyes unreadable as stone. Other days he seemed restless, his temper sharper than usual, his tone clipped even in the smallest exchanges. Olivia noticed the strain in his posture, the weight that pressed down on his shoulders when he thought no one was watching. She wondered if he carried the world too tightly in his grasp, unwilling to loosen his hold for fear that everything would shatter. Her role, however, had changed. She was no longer just a secretary, shuffling papers and typing notes. Executives now looked to her during meetings, waiting for her translations, her interpretations. Her ability to dissolve tension before it spiraled out of control. James still tested her, but the challenges had shifted in nature. They were no longer designed merely to break her endurance. They were crafted to sharpen her, to prepare her for moments when precision and courage could alter the course of entire negotiations. It was during one such moment that the cracks in James's armor deepened. A high-stakes investor summit in London drew leaders from across the globe. Olivia accompanied James, once again seated beside him at the long table, where fortunes were decided with words instead of weapons. The conversations were relentless. Hours of strategy disguised in polite formalities. But it was during a private dinner, away from cameras and reporters, that the tension reached its peak. One of the investors, a powerful magnate from Eastern Europe, pushed for terms that would strip Blackwood International of significant autonomy. His words were veiled in charm, but Olivia could hear the steel beneath. James, usually unshakable, grew sharper with each reply, his voice firm but his control thinning. She saw the tightening of his jaw, a flash of something raw in his eyes, not just irritation, but a kind of exhaustion that left him vulnerable. Then came the remark that shifted everything. The investor, with a sly smile, suggested that James's company was becoming too dependent on decorative figures rather than true leaders. His gaze flicked briefly toward Olivia, the implication clear. The insult was subtle enough to pass as banter, but heavy enough to poison the air. Olivia felt the sting, her chest tightening, as every eye turned toward her. Before she could respond, James leaned forward, his voice like tempered steel. "Blackwood International has no room for decoration," he said, his tone low, measured. "Every member of my team earns their place at the table. If you mistake strength for ornament, then perhaps it is your perception, not our company, that is flawed." The room went silent. The investor's smirk faltered, his glass pausing midair. Olivia sat frozen, her heart pounding, her throat tight with emotion. James had not only defended her, he had done so with a ferocity that stripped away the indifference he usually wore like armor. Later that night, after the summit ended and the others dispersed, Olivia found herself alone in the quiet corridors of the hotel. The golden lights reflected off the marble walls, casting long shadows as she replayed his words again and again. She did not hear his footsteps until he was beside her. "You should not let men like that disturb you," James said softly, his voice lacking its usual edge. Olivia turned, searching his face. "I'm used to people underestimating me," she admitted. "Damn, but today, it felt different. Oh, more personal." His gaze lingered on her, and for once, the mask slipped fully. The exhaustion in his eyes was unhidden, the weight of years carried in silence laid bare for her to see. "It was personal," he said quietly, "and that is why I will not allow it to stand." She did not know what to say, only that the man standing before her was no longer the untouchable figure from glossy magazine covers. He was human, fragile beneath the power, carrying scars she could not yet see. And for the first time, she realized just how dangerous vulnerability could be, not in business, but in life. In the days that followed, the bond between them grew unspoken but undeniable. Their conversations stretched beyond business, slipping into quiet moments when James asked about her family, her studies, her dreams. She learned that he had built his empire not only on ambition, but also on loss that still haunted him in the silence of empty rooms. He never spoke in detail, but the shadows in his eyes told stories he could not bear to voice. For Olivia, those glimpses were enough. She saw not the cold billionaire the world admired or feared, but the man behind the glass walls, the one who had sacrificed pieces of himself for success. And though she told herself that this connection was fleeting, professional, necessary for the work they shared, she could not ignore the way her heart tightened. Whenever his gaze lingered a moment too long, the tension came to a head one evening, when an unexpected power outage struck the Blackwood headquarters. Olivia had stayed late, sorting through documents, when the lights flickered and the building plunged into darkness. Emergency systems hummed to life, but the silence of the vast office was suffocating. She stumbled through the corridors with her phone's flashlight, only to find James already there, his own figure outlined by the glow of his screen. "You're still here?" he remarked, his voice echoing in the quiet. "So are you," she replied, forcing a small smile. For a moment, neither moved. The shadows seemed to press closer, the silence amplifying the unspoken words between them. James's expression softened, just slightly, and in that fragile space of darkness, he looked less like a man of power and more like a man searching for something he had lost long ago. Olivia's breath caught, her pulse quickening. She knew that whatever path lay ahead, it was no longer just about contracts, translations, or negotiations. Something far deeper was taking root, something that neither of them could control, and in that realization lay both danger and hope. The turning point, the storm that would decide everything, came without warning. Blackwood International, riding high on the success of its European and Asian alliances, suddenly found itself on the brink of collapse. A scandal, fabricated but powerful, swept through the financial press like wildfire. Accusations of unethical dealings, whispers of fraudulent contracts, and claims of exploitation threatened to unravel years of hard work. Rivals circled like vultures, investors pulled back with trembling hands, and the empire James had built began to quake. Inside the towering glass headquarters, the atmosphere grew heavier by the hour. Executives scrambled, lawyers argued, and board members whispered about succession plans should James fall. Through it all, James remained a pillar of control, or at least he appeared to be. Behind the closed doors of his office, the weight of betrayal and doubt bore down on him with relentless force. For the first time in his career, he faced not only the possibility of losing his company, but of losing himself. Olivia stood at the center of the storm with him. She had no obligation to remain beyond her role, no reason to stake her future on. A battle that was not hers to fight, yet something deep within her refused to walk away. She had seen the man behind the glass walls, the one who carried scars no scandal could fabricate. She knew his empire had been built not on deception, but on sacrifice and relentless will. And so, she chose to stand beside him when others wavered. The crisis came to a head during an emergency board meeting. The directors, their faces tight. With fear demanded explanations James could not give without breaching confidences. Every word he spoke seemed only to fuel their doubt. Olivia, seated at the far end of the table, watched helplessly as their votes began to sway toward removing him from power. She knew that if they succeeded, everything he had worked for would vanish in an instant. It was then that she rose. Her voice, clear and steady, cut through the room like a blade. "I have something to say," she began, ignoring the startled looks of the board. She spoke not as a secretary, but as a witness to James's integrity. She told them of the countless negotiations where he had refused easy shortcuts, where he had chosen fairness over profit, where he had defended his team at the risk of his own reputation. She described the discipline with which he demanded excellence not for ego, but for the belief that their company could set a standard the world would follow. The room grew silent as her words spilled forth, filled not with polished rhetoric, but with truth. And when she finished, she turned to James, her eyes steady. "I would not stand here today if I did not believe in him. He is not a man who builds empires on lies. He is a man who carries burdens most of us cannot imagine. And if you strip him of this company now, you will not only betray him, you will betray the very principles this company was founded upon." For a long, breathless moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, heads began to nod. Tide shifted, the votes paused, and the motion to remove James was tabled. The scandal would still need to be fought, the truth proven, but for now, the empire stood.